I think I need to start by acknowledging that I am missing my podium very, very much. I realize that this is a piece of furniture that I hold on to with a death grip, usually during these types of events. And I think what we're maybe already hearing in this conversation is maybe part of what the initiative of this event is about. We have academics, like myself. We have people from business and industry, innovators, but innovators coming from different perspectives, and I think just crucially been touched upon very different vocabularies. And I welcome the challenge that we try to speak together, but I think we're already picking up on the reality that when we are in our more familiar communities, we rely on a set of vocabularies that we assume the rest of the room thinks are familiar, probably mistakenly sometimes, but this is a really interesting challenge when we now cut across each other and have to figure these things out. I'm a writer, but I studied woven textile design, and I really only write about textiles, and I really feel that words are, in a way, my material. But I am an academic. This morning, Latsma opened things by advocating simplicity and a really fair, I think, criticism of the inaccessibility a lot of academic work and language uses. The simplicity part, I think, is a lot tougher, because I think sometimes when we really make things simple, there's a very large chance that perspectives are excluded, and they're locked in a cycle of exclusion. But I take the other warning about academic communication. I wonder even sometimes if it's a little bit on purpose. It's a club that people join and other people get pushed away from. I say these things because I have done something that's really against my personality and often a provocation in this title, and I'm not a very provocative person for those of you that know me. But you just heard a little bit touching upon new materialism, a group of philosophical thinking that has, I think, become a little bit of a wildfire through academic writing at the moment. I teach and I write, so I'm speaking a little bit from the perspective of a warning maybe to students as much as anything else, but picking up on the last comments as well about the work that needs to be done to find out what our vocabularies mean. So old materialism is my attempt to be provocative, which makes me incredibly nervous. So if new materialism is very excited about recognizing the agency of materials in networks which we are understanding needs far more respect and attention for many reasons, but one of them being the environmental crisis that we're living in, then I don't have much of a quibble with any of that except for maybe the new bit. So I've pulled together a couple of examples as thinking exercises more than anything else. More because I see students in particular latching onto this vocabulary, which is actually sometimes pretty impenetrable philosophical writing, and treating it as though it is the first time that these types of ideas have been discussed or worked through in humanity, and I think that's a little bit wobbly. I'm very nervous of academic fashions and academic trends, and I think we have that in academic discourse in exactly the same way we would have it on the vocabulary or anything else. Not having a podium makes it very thirsty. So I start with maybe an example of someone who is often in fashion research acknowledged as a designer who does work with new materialist ideas. Iris van Herpen, the Dutch fashion designer who works with couture. This is a very early work by hers. It's not the only one in existence. And each of my examples has, as I mentioned, a little bit of a historical bent to it, and I actually realized a little bit of a conservation bent to it, as in how we conserve materials. So this is a dress, if you want to believe it. It hooks over the model's shoulders and wraps around the back. It apparently is excruciatingly painful to wear. It cuts the models when they wear them. I am very interested in bodily knowledge, as a lot of people who work in crafts research. Tacit knowledge, the knowledge that our hands, but actually even physically in this case she's referring to really her whole entire body that inspired this work. So Van Herpen had a little tradition of celebrating the end of each collection with a free-fall parachute jump. And so she refers to this being this skeleton coming about because it evokes the moment of free fall when every fiber of the body feels as though it is rowing in all directions, as if the body is turned inside out. That's a little bit of an aside as to what she might have been thinking when she was working with this. But what I am interested in talking about in relation to this little bit of an argument about new or old is how these dresses, if we want to call them that, are faring now, because they're a conservator's nightmare in the museums. And it's because some of the materials were recycled. So the process damages the sintering process is the damage that it creates, and this was very early work that she did. A lot of the conversation today, often people ask questions about the future, and it isn't tested yet. So that's also, of course, part of the excitement, but part of the risk and the projection. But because this was often something that was never intended to be an object with a long lifespan, there wasn't a huge amount of concern about whether remixing some of the sintered materials, the sintered powders, would then lead to weaknesses in the object later on. But it does. So these things are breaking all the time. There are also at least 2 of these dresses, and the date that they were born, if you want to say that, the date that they came into existence isn't necessarily for a conservator a particular accurate reflection of the age of the materials and their vulnerability, because they don't really know how many times the powders have been recycled in the sintering. As an aside, the most recent collection intentionally uses recycled powders, and I think in a way that's been developed more stably. Conservators in a museum are charged with ensuring that all objects that enter their collection last as long as possible, a goal difficult to achieve for an object that was only meant to live a short life. So this is an object that has new and old materials accidentally somehow blended together, because the assumption, at least from the technology point of view, was it was never meant to be something that lasted. But someone gets famous, their career takes off, museums invest a hell of a lot of money in keeping things, and conservators are then tasked with the whole point of a museum, which is preserving things for the future. She is still basically my conventional example. If you're interested in her, you will see a lot of new materialist analysis of the ways that this particular designer works and the life of her materials, and how she many times gets her ideas from responding to precarious materials that are constantly changing, including the fact that she says that she doesn't have ready-to-wear collections. Working in couture allows her to risk experiments that sometimes have very unpredictable time frame to them. And so she continues to work in what I think we would probably think would be too conservative a realm, but to buy that time. Oh my God, that is 5. whiplash. We go to something entirely different. But this is where I have a little bit of a rub with new materialism, and at least the rather superficial way I feel like we're starting to run to it in craft discourse. This is a book from the turn of the last century with a batik velvet cover, which comes from a Dutch Art Nouveau tradition, but at a time when the Dutch were colonized the present-day Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. They were in the East Indies for centuries, and they, as traders, and from 1850 onwards, ran the islands as a pretty aggressive economic colonial enterprise. Kooperaes spent time there, and this particular novel of his is based there, which is part of the reasons why they used an Indonesian textile tradition for the cover. Translates as the hidden force in English. It's the story of a Dutch family who are living there, and events that occur in the house when they have crossed cultural lines and ethical lines, taboos. And what happens is these materials that I think new materialism gets so excited in telling us, have a life and have a presence, and even do things beyond what we planned for them to do. In this case, it's being used as a critique of the colonial enterprise. So the house begins to disintegrate as a feud develops between the main character and the local population. There is a love affair which is considered pretty inappropriate between the stepson and the mother. And there is also an analysis of a rise of Islam on the island of Java, and a sense of impending anxiety about whose authority will actually be in place. It was written at the turn of the century, so Dutch colonial power is firm at this point in time. But I think it is also beginning to be a prediction in this material collapse of another type of power collapse that's coming. The Dutch will leave by the end of the war. An inventory of calamities. My garden is a swamp. I talk about the tropical rains. 3 chairs on my front veranda are cracking apart. White ants have eaten my lovely Japanese rugs. For some inexplicable reason, a new silk dress has come out in damp stains. Another, purely from heat, I think, has disintegrated into a few threads. So as the power dynamics of the colony are eroding, the material world of the colonizer is also eroding around them. Picking up on the Iris van Herpen example, I've long had a fascination with this sentence from Robert Healy, an Australian researcher. She talks first about this idea that the conservation of materials tends to talk about all of these weaknesses. In museum condition reports document this progress through a language of vulnerability and loss, just like the colony's loss. Descriptions of shattered silk, degraded fibers, disfiguring stains, insect attacks. But what I find fascinating about Healy's writing on this is the power dynamic that it's also critiquing. The radical and irreversible changes that occur through decay propose a framework to consider design and culture of dress. I like to add in textiles. The continuing breakdown creates a disorder that cannot be contained, one that symbolically challenges the authority of the museum, or I think in that early Kooperaes book from 1900, the colony itself. So people have long used this idea of materials being dynamic and highly, highly networked, not digital, but I would also like to suggest they've been innate to our thinking for a long time. And very briefly, my last example is a tuffy. The Swedish-born Norwegian artist Hanna Ryggen, very large tapestry that we are looking at here, that had to go through significant conservation work. So the tapestry was present in the building that Beverik planted a bomb outside the high-rise building before he drove to the island of Utoya and massacred so many of the young people and students who were gathering for a labour workshop. As an aside, one of the horrors of this attack that he was able to do, if we need any more convincing that materials are so powerful in our world, was he stole a policeman's uniform and wore it to get onto the island and to manipulate people to come closer to him before he killed them, because they thought he was a policeman coming to help. I am not equating the repair of a tapestry to any type of recovery that can happen in this type of situation. I have to make that utterly clear. But I think that it's another interesting example of old materials and how they continue to record the horrors, the networks, the dynamics that we continue to live in. So the conservation report for that tapestry refers to all of the damage. First of all, it was just left in the building for a couple of days. That's understandable. It's not first priority. So it was rippled, stained, and covered with all of those weaknesses, actually maybe even that the Irstan Hepburn work has, but for totally different reasons. This is now a very material record of a very violent and successful attack, and really unusual for the country of Norway as well. So broken glass, wood splinters, various building materials were over the entire tapestry, some loose on the surface, much embedded in the tapestry. I leave you with that as an offering to not be intimidated by some of these pretty heavy philosophical ideas that float around academic discourse, but also maybe try to own them in our own ways. So that was a very brief example of me trying to own them and apply them in a way that maybe makes it a bit more useful than keeping it in the abstraction.
Would you like to ask at the moment? Okay, then please hold yes over there.
Thanks, brilliant talk, really enjoyed it. It made me think about something I haven't thought about before, which is how climate change and the increase in temperatures is affecting the textiles around us. I've heard something from a researcher that's not out yet, something, as we're sort of encouraging second-hand clothing more and more with consumers, one thing we might be doing is spreading moth infestations throughout more houses, which is leading to more degradation of other textiles, and all these unknown sort of implications and knock-on effects.
Yep.
Any thoughts about that?
Yep. Well, we share an interest in storytelling, I think, and the last piece of writing that's in the Textile Reader, which is an anthology I edited a decade ago, but re-edited for next year, is an Ursula Le Guin short story called The Trouble with the Cotton People. And of course, it's Ursula Le Guin, if you are familiar, was a type of science fiction writer, you could say. And she is basing it in California that now has a climate crisis. It is underwater, and the cotton people are trading with the wine people. And the cotton that is being shipped for the good wines is getting sleazy. It is getting poorer and poorer quality. And there's real aggro over this. The good quality wines are going one way, the bad textiles are going the other way. What the hell is going on? Finally, they realize they have not met in generations. Maybe something has to be done through dialogue. And when they eventually do this waterlogged journey through California to get down to the cotton people, they are living in a climate crisis, and so the crops have failed, and the saline water that has come into the land has weakened everything that they're growing, and now I'm going to spoil the whole story to you, but at the end they talk about they were too proud to admit that they had problems. And so I think it's a wonderful way to think about. It is a wake-up call, as far, I mean, this is what a lot of Le Guin's writing is about, but a wake-up call for the problems that are coming our way. But the narrative ends with this idea of you must then sit down together and talk about this. If you had told us you had crop failure, we wouldn't have been angry about the trade with the wine. So I think there are lots of warnings like that we just, they already exist, we just have to maybe hear them a bit differently.
Any other questions?